Everyone, and this is class 30. We're going to finish our discussion of the civil rights movement and move to thinking about the ideas about democratic repair and democratic sacrifice that Hooker raises in the article that you read for today. So let's go ahead and jump right into today's lecture. We're going to pick up where we left off in the historical narrative and move up to discuss the Black Lives Matter movement and thinking about different kind of strategies of political struggle and the role of African American activism in American democracy. And we're going to be recalling some of the discussion we had with the 1619 Project. So picking up where we left off last class with the end of Reconstruction, and in the aftermath, as we discussed briefly, there was massive disenfranchisement of African Americans in the South through the creation of black codes, but more specifically through various ways of manipulating the laws to prevent African Americans from registering or voting. So these included literacy tests in which poll workers and test administrators would intentionally give more difficult passages to read to African Americans, as well as understanding tests in which a piece of law or a provision of the Constitution would be presented, and they would and the prospective voter would have to explain the meaning or interpret this obscure constitutional provision, and many of these provisions would have also negatively affected or risked disenfranchising poor and poorly educated whites in the South. So they also devised grandfather clauses that exempted those who had been allowed to vote prior to the Civil War from literacy and understanding tests. And these ultimately created a loophole so that it was only so that the poor and poorly educated whites would still be able to pass these, would not be subject to the same tests that were intended to target against African Americans who were already discriminated against in terms of educational opportunities. Many southern states also instituted poll taxes of a per person tax of $1 or $2, which would have been a $20 or $50 tax today. So imagine just kind of if you had to pay $50 in order to register to vote or to cast your ballot, that might dissuade you, especially if you're already on the margins of voting. If we think back to when we discussed Downs and the paradox of voting, right? If you start adding additional costs to voting, that's going to discourage people from voting. Furthermore, Democratic parties in the South created what's known as the all-white primary, and they argued that because these were primaries and these were not public elections, that these did not violate the 15th Amendment because these were the elections within a private group. That the party elections aren't for public offices, and so, what this meant was that staunch segregationists would always win the Democratic nomination. There was no chance for an African American candidate to win in the Democratic Party as well, or even a anti-segregationist to win in the Democratic Party. And so, in addition to these political efforts at disenfranchisement, Jim Crow South was also the land of segregations, separate facilities, neighborhoods, separate restrooms, separate train cars on trains, seats in buses, and these were upheld by the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, that as long as the facilities were equal, that separate facilities did not violate the 14th Amendment. There's also unequal legal protection for African Americans in the South, with various laws about imprisoning idle African Americans that were used to discriminate against unemployed or homeless African Americans in a way that they were not used to discriminate against white people the same who are also unemployed or also homeless. So in this context of segregation and legal disenfranchisement, we see a series of mobilizations around in the early 20th century. For example, Booker T. Washington pushed for what was known as the Atlanta Compromise, and this was a compromise with white political elites, in which the compromise was that Southern African Americans would be willing to forego full civil and political rights in exchange for basic education and due process. And the goals And the goal here for Booker T. Washington was to prioritize education, economic development, in gaining that type of foothold, rather than focusing on political equality, integration, or political justice, and that the idea here was that the economic emancipation was going to be more important and more valuable in the long run, and that they would be willing to compromise on full political rights if they were able to gain education and able to get jobs. Um, in contrast, W.E.B. Du Bois argued for a more forceful confrontational efforts. And for Du Bois, it really was he vehemently contested Washington's Atlantic Compromise and argued that you couldn't have economic enfranchisement, you couldn't have economic emancipation or economic equality if you didn't have full civil and political equality. And so you needed to take on the question of segregation and the question of disenfranchisement head on if you wanted to achieve the types of economic and educational goals that Booker T. Washington advocated for. Du Bois founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in 1909, and the NAACP went on to pursue a primary legal strategy, and they tried to fight segregation in the courts. They opted a litigation strategy. In 1938, in the decision of Missouri ex rel. Gaines versus Canada, in which Gaines wanted to enroll in the Lincoln University's School of Law, at the University of Missouri. The courts, and when he was denied, he sued all the way up to the Supreme Court with the support of the NAACP. The court ultimately offered the states a choice in order to maintain consistency with both the Plessy decision and with the 14th Amendment. That the states either had to desegregate their public higher educational institutions, so they could not have segregated public universities and colleges, or they had to establish equally funded black colleges and universities. And pretty much all of the states opted for the latter option. And this is where we get the origin of the HBCU, the historically black colleges and universities that were founded by the states in order to prevent the full integration of higher education. From this decision, school desegregation became a major focus, and much of this turns around the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas decision, which was actually a bunch of different cases that were grouped together and heard at the same time under the name of Brown versus Board. And the court found in this 1954 decision that was unanimous that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And the argument was that if you were going to have segregated facilities, segregated school systems, that they would never have the same quality of facilities, resources, or instructions, that there is always going to be higher quality given to the white schools. They also drew on a series of social scientific studies that found that segregation itself, regardless of the quality of instruction, created feelings of inferiority for black students, therefore meaning that separate could never be equal. And it was very important for Chief Justice Earl Warren at the time that this be a unanimous decision. Remember when we talked about the politics of the courts a while ago, the idea of judicial legitimacy, that because the judiciary cannot self-execute its own decisions and it requires on the support and perception of legitimacy by the political branches in order for its decisions to be meaningful and taken seriously, they have to maintain a kind of apolitical appearance, right, to maintain their judicial legitimacy. And Warren wanted that to ensure that the decision was unanimous in order to maintain that it was maintained that this was not a political, or this is not a partisan decision, that this was going to be the only way to preserve the institutional legitimacy of the court, as well as to avoid backlash by southern states. And we'll talk about how that ultimately did not work. Eventually, Warren was able to, he drafted the opinion and kept circulating it and meeting with all the justices until he got an opinion that could be endorsed by all the members of the court. However, despite Warren's efforts, many Southern governors and school districts simply refused to desegregate schools. So this was known as massive resistance. This maintained that they attempted to maintain segregated schools. They refused to integrate the schools. Many Southern schools simply would close their schools rather than integrate them. That they would rather have they'd rather have no public schools open than integrated public schools. This came to a head in Little Rock, Arkansas, where the governor refused to integrate the schools and tried to use the Arkansas National Guard in Little Rock to prevent the forced integration of these schools. President Eisenhower then federalized the National Guard and basically took them out of the hands of the state governor and used them to escort 9 children to and from their classes, and some of the most famous pictures from the civil rights movement. However, in 1955, the Supreme Court reconsidered arguments that by schools requesting relief concerning the task of desegregation. And in this decision, which became known as Brown 2, the court delegated the task of carrying out school desegregation to district courts with orders that desegregation occur with, quote, all deliberate speed. Now, like every court decision that we've been talking about from throughout this last few weeks, with all deliberate speed is deliberately vague, and so this gave both flexibility for states and localities that were resistant to segregation, but still provided political cover. There's lots of different politics going on here with this language of all deliberate speed. Now, of course, despite the end of legalized school segregation, schools remain fairly segregated today. Part of it is a function of continued neighborhood segregation in the way that we fund and organize school districts. But while the overall makeup of U.S. public schools is fairly representative of the country's demographics as a whole, as you can see from this chart over here, that the average white student attends a school that is almost 70% their own race. And so there is still what is known as de facto segregation, despite the end of de jure segregation. And so there is still significant amounts of segregation in the school systems today. Additionally, in the 50s, setting up the kind of the civil rights movement of the 60s, which we are probably more familiar of, is the Montgomery bus boycott from 1955-1966, beginning on December 5th, 1955, in which Rosa Parks, an African-American woman, was arrested for refusing to surrender her seat on the bus to a white person. And this lasted an entire year until the Supreme Court, until a federal ruling in Browder versus Gale took effect, which desegregated the Alabama, and it basically overruled the Alabama and Montgomery laws that segregated buses, and held that bus segregation was unconstitutional. And this was, as you may or may not know, a highly planned and stylized effort by the NAACP. That they intentionally chose who would be the person to take the stand and be arrested. And this was an effort to politicize and publicize the effects of segregation, and to kind of rally people around the country to the civil rights movement. However, the limited federal action in the 50s and the early 60s prompted the creation of more grassroots groups that were tired of the NAACP's more litigatory and legal strategy. So groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, the Congress for Racial Equality, CORE, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, started forming in southern states, and they advocated for direct action and civil disobedience rather than working through the courts. Direct action being the idea that we're going to kind of act in specific contexts and in response to specific segregation measures. So here we have iconic photos of SNCC activists working, trying to desegregate lunch counters by and simply asserting their rights to full and equal protection and equal rights to public businesses, despite being harassed by the crowd here. And civil disobedience was the idea that to protest and highlight the unjustness of a law, they would intentionally break the law in order to demonstrate the inequalities that were built into this law. And as you're reading from King, the letter from a Birmingham jail kind of outlines some of the logic and the reasoning and the political theory behind that. And we'll talk about that, and you all will talk about that in your discussion threads for today. In 1961, the Freedom Rides were organized, and many of these organized by CORE and the SCLC, in which civil rights activists rode interstate buses into segregated southern states in 1961 and beyond to challenge the non-enforcement of Supreme Court decisions, Morgan versus Virginia and Boynton versus Virginia, that that were 1946 and 1960 decisions, respectively, that ruled that segregated public buses were unconstitutional. And so many southern states ignored these rulings. And so the Freedom Rides left. The first Freedom Ride left from Washington, D.C. in May 4th, 1961, and was supposed to arrive in New Orleans on May 17th. But these Freedom Rides faced mob violence, especially in stops throughout Alabama, in Anniston, Birmingham, and Montgomery. These were organized by Bull Connor and other police commissioners, as well as members of the Ku Klux Klan. The Freedom Riders, which were both white and black activists, were attacked. They were violently, many were arrested, some were violently beaten. Buses were burnt out. But the SCLC and CORE worked to basically recruit new volunteers to kind of replace those who were injured or arrested, to continue these rides to further demonstrate the reality of segregation. In 1963, A. Philip Randolph and Baynard Rustin organized the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, known as the March on Washington, that took place on August 28th, 1963. It's estimated that over 250,000 people, a majority of whom were African American marchers. This is joined in one of the largest political rallies for human rights in the U.S. history. And on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. King gave the famous "I Have a Dream" speech, and this was really the goal here was to put efforts to demonstrate the political salience of civil rights and to put kind of electoral and political pressure on lawmakers to pass more robust civil rights legislation. And to some extent it worked. The Kennedy administration kind of allied itself within the civil rights for pushing for civil rights legislation. After Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson kind of took this on as a way to realize Kennedy's legacy, also to realize the enormous political gains to be made by the Democratic Party, as we talked about when we talked about realignment, right? The Democratic Party pushing for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was one of these periods of realignment in which the Republican and Democratic parties flipped on the question of segregation and racial justice, and this created the loyalty and it kind of shifted the racial demographics of the party, and there's many reasons why African American voters are loyal to the Democratic Party. The Civil Rights Act has several provisions that outlawed government discrimination and unequal application of voting qualifications. It outlawed segregation in public businesses, so this was hotels, buses, trains, lunch counters, restaurants, bars. It outlawed employment discrimination, and it created the Equal Opportunity Commission to monitor employment discrimination claims. In 1965, the shift focused more towards emphasizing voting rights. And Dr. King led a march to Selma, Alabama, to protest where voting rights expansion had been violently resisted. And there was a series of marches. The march, because the initial two marches ultimately failed. The first was resisted by local police. The second ultimately was kind of called off midway through to avoid a violent confrontation with protesters and the police. After the second attempted march, two white ministers who had joined Dr. King and the activists were brutally attacked, one of whom was murdered. And these televised images of brutality basically made it possible for the third march to be successful. And this put pressure on Congress for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we talked about last week, right? With these had the provisions about securing equal right to vote, but also the provision that was struck down in the Shelby County decision that required pre-clearance for any states with a history of segregation and voting discrimination before they could change any of their voting restrictions. Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, and at the time he was working on emphasizing not just the civil and political rights, but also economic rights and economic justice for African Americans and for poor people everywhere. The goals here were employment and income redistribution. And while we often think of Dr. King's nonviolence as a hallmark of the civil rights movement, in many ways the story is incomplete without also talking about more radical aspects of the civil rights movements, including Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, with famous for the speech "The Ballot or the Bullet." That for Malcolm X, there was the goal, the goal of racial justice would be, if it was not going to be achieved through normal political means, through the ballot, it was going to be achieved through, he was willing to embrace the use of violence for that. Similarly, as you can see here in this image, the Black Panther Party mobilized around arguments for Black nationalism and the embrace of the use of violence, justified use of violence to ensure and protect African Americans going to vote, and working to to enforce the civil rights that were not being protected and not being enforced by federal and local officials. And as you've read in the Hooker piece, from Juliet Hooker's argument, there is that we tell a sanitized version of the civil rights movement, and your textbook does this, and I've definitely done this to some extent even here. And it's important to kind of dispel these romantic narratives, and we'll talk about her reasoning in just a second. And Juliet, so Hooker's article kind of begins in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, which began as a hashtag on social media after the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of the African-American teenager Trayvon Martin in Florida. The movement became more nationally recognized as a protest movement following demonstrations after of the 2014 killings of Michael Brown in Ferguson, near St. Louis, Missouri, and Eric Garner in New York City, both of whom were unarmed African-Americans who were killed by police. And these protests have been kind of spread throughout the country, especially in the response to the police actions that have killed African Americans, many of whom were unarmed, many of whom were young. And this has kind of expanded to become a more national grassroots effort. They have local chapters in over 30 different localities between 2014 and 2016, but doesn't have the same hierarchical structure of the civil rights movement. There aren't clear leaders. It's more of a kind of a network of activists and movements. And Juliet Hooker, in the essay that you were reading for today, it engages a series of criticisms of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that the Black Lives Matter movement is often criticized for not fulfilling the type of doing civil rights protests and doing protest politics the right way. And the right way is often this sanitized version of the civil rights movements, where you dress up in a suit, you give a speech, you protest, you break the law, you quietly and willingly accept your punishment for breaking the law, and then that is going to convince racist whites to change their mind about segregation. But Hooker's arguing that this is just a mistaken conception of how democratic activism should work, and so she's building her argument on this idea of democratic sacrifice and democratic repair. And Hooker takes up this idea from the political theorist Melvin Rogers, that the bargain of democracy is that sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, but that the game should be structured in a fair way, that no one should be a perpetual loser of the democratic game. No one should always see their interests always frustrated, because the rules are supposed to be fair enough that they are not supposed to be systematically biased. However, and Hooker develops this idea of democratic winners and losers to the idea of democratic sacrifice, and that she takes from Daniel Allen as well, that democracy requires sacrifice. We don't always get what we want, or we aren't always able to get the policies that we want, but that a fair democracy means that the democratic sacrifices should be evenly distributed throughout the citizenry. And Hooker's question is, when other citizens and state institutions betray a pervasive lack of concern for Black suffering, which in turn makes it impossible for those wrongs to be redressed, is it fair to ask Blacks to make further sacrifice on behalf of the polity? And she's worried about transforming the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter and other Black liberation movements into exemplars of democratic sacrifice, in which we romanticize the Black activists as ideal democratic citizens, and many of us, many and white bystanders, and I've used the us and we to include myself here, offload the labor of doing democratic repair, of like fixing the broken parts of our democracy, of making good on our democratic promises and principles. And we basically displace that labor and work and suffering to the people who are already suffering and neglected by democratic systems themselves. And this is a narrative that we even kind of saw a little bit in the 1619 project that we started this semester with, that kind of idealized the idea of African American activism, this idea that like African Americans made American democracy, and Hooker's argument is what happens when we don't evenly share in this democratic labor, and then when we expect those who are suffering to do the hard work and work on behalf of the common good. Isn't that like doubly unfair? And she writes on page 455 of the essay, there's a very real danger that the notion of acquiescence to democratic loss as political exemplarity demands a kind of civic sacrifice of Blacks that is not expected of other citizens. The question of whether the burden of sacrifice is still unequally distributed can be fruitfully explored by considering how traditional winners in U.S. democracy have coped with loss. The civil rights victories of the 1960s that resulted in the end of Jim Crow, for example, did constitute a moment of political loss for white citizens committed to a racial polity where they had exclusive access to political power and privilege. Have white citizens been good losers? Arguably not, as historically victories in the struggle for racial equality have been followed by eras of deep and sustained backlash in which Blacks and other minorities have borne the brunt of racial terror, violence, and xenophobia. This dynamic is certainly evident in the climate of white racial resentment that quickly followed the post-racial euphoria occasioned by Barack Obama's election in 2008. And her argument here, and that's on page 455 of the reading, her argument here is that African Americans are asked to, when they are excluded and lose in the political game of American democracy, to act in a way that is exemplars of democratic sacrifice, to bear the burden, to pay the price, to quietly resist without threatening the democratic system itself. However, when white segregationists and white racists are called to give up their unequal privileges in American democracy, they respond with violence, with xenophobia, and with hatred. And so she argues that critiques of Black Lives Matter rest on flawed assumptions about the civil rights movement. The first is a romantic progressivist history, that the history of the United States is in constant progress, in which the civil rights movement kind of helped bend the arc of time towards justice. And this downplays the more radical aspects of the movements and significant disagreements within the movement itself about the use of nonviolence and to what effectiveness nonviolence could play. It also assumes that nonviolence was effective at persuading whites, but many whites at the time, as she argues, failed to see the civil rights movement as heroic sacrifice. And high levels of racial resentment mean that you can't easily shame people with highly racialized views into racial solidarity with Blacks. Finally, she's concerned about a framing of nonviolence as sacrifice that doesn't square with the way that activists see themselves. The activists saw themselves as engaged in defiant resistance, not passive sacrifice. And so she argues that we should think of riots not as doing protests the wrong way or bad forms of activism, but instead she writes in the conclusion of the essay, if formulations of Black politics as democratic sacrifice create a trap whereby any deviation from submission, respectability, and nonviolence serves to render Black grievances illegitimate, perhaps we should instead consider instances of rioting as a form of democratic redress for Black citizens, even if in and of themselves they cannot transform the prevailing social order. These instances of violence, which are often viewed as self-destructive, might be productive for Black citizens because they allow for the expression of Black anger and pain, which are otherwise precluded by expectations of Black sacrifice and forgiveness. that rather than seeing kind of self-effacing sacrifice and acquiescence to racialized political orders as the exemplarity of the civil rights movement, that perhaps the riot is the appropriate and correct form of democratic protest given our current situation. So next class, there isn't a class. It's your last midterm for the semester. Again, it'll follow the same format as the previous take-home midterm, and hopefully you all feel comfortable with this format. There'll be 4 short answer questions. You'll answer 4 of a possible 6. Again, these are supposed to be 200 to 300 words. I will be penalizing if you are going significantly over that out of fairness, and these will be due on Sunday 4/19 at midnight Pacific time. Please upload these as a Word document to the Moodle assignment. And for your discussion thread for today, carefully reread Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. Describe how King conceives of nonviolent resistance. And how does King's argument fit into Hooker's discussion of democratic repair? Based on both King and Hooker, who do you think, based on these arguments, who bears responsibility for realizing the United States' democratic values? And as a reminder, you can write for either of the posts, either of the prompts that have been posted for this week, with a 200 post by Friday at midnight, and then by Sunday at midnight, you should reply to one of your peers with a 100-word reply. That is going to wrap things up for today. As always, if you have any questions, join in for office hours, send me an email, stop by the discussion section. Happy to chat more about this, answer any questions. If you're having any issues completing the assignments, accessing the material, please let me know as soon as you can so that we can make arrangements so that you can finish the coursework on time for the semester. As always, stay safe, wash your hands, continue that physical distancing, and keep taking care of each other, and I will see you next time.